Okay, let's, if we could, let's get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's presentation, this evening's program. I'm Jim Van Epps, the chair of the Savannah Council's Program Committee, and host for this evening's presentation by Ambassador Dan Shields, sitting here in the second chair, entitled The Diplomatic Instrument of Power in the Indo-Pacific Region. So we're so glad to see you and to meet finally in person. It's been a couple months since we've been able to do that. The Indo-Pacific region is one that we haven't approached recently, and this is going to be both interesting and educational, and I'm excited about it. I'd like to do two things before we get started. One is to mention that we've had the passing of another one of our members, and that's Bill Donahue, who passed recently. I just found out this morning. But some of you will remember Bill, just a big smile, a tall guy, and engaging. We'll really miss him because he adds a lot to any group. He added a lot to any group that he was in. Secondly, I'd like to, as I said I would do last time that we had a virtual presentation, at our annual meeting I indicated that we had elected 5 new board members. Now, I was reelected as was Doug Everly in the back there. But we have 5 new, and I'd like, if you'd stand, just wave your hand briefly. Roger Armour. Roger, there he is, right there. If you know Roger, you can't miss him. And then Jerry Thomas. There he is in the back. Hey, thank you, Jerry. Chris Giorgiani, he is not here as best last time I looked around. And Fred Langley sitting at the front desk, and you saw him when you walked in. So these are 4 of our new members. The 5th one that you might recall from the presentation last month, and that's retired Ambassador Larry Silverman, who gave our presentation last January. So congratulations again, and thank you to the 5 new board members who are going to help us. Now, I'd like to begin by acknowledging our sponsors for the program, and that is those of you who attended often recognize that Kreitz Auto Group is a continuing platinum sponsor of the Savannah Council for 2021 and 2022. Kreitz is our local exclusive dealer for Buick, GMC, BMW, as you can see on the screen, Mercedes-Benz, and Sprinter vans, and we appreciate their continuing sponsorship of our programs. Thank you, Kreitz. Secondly is, Audiology and Hearing Services, or AHAS, which provides patient care, its top priority, through its team of experienced doctors of audiology, using an evidence-based approach to testing and recommending the best hearing healthcare available to meet the unique needs of every patient. Thank you so much to AHAS for your support. And next is, bingo. The Learning Center, a program of the Senior Citizens, Inc., which provides intellectually engaging, humanities-based educational classes. And the classes range from 1-hour lectures to 9 weeks worth of lectures, or courses on a variety of topics. Thank you to Roger Smith. I don't see Roger here tonight. He's a former director of the Savannah Council, and thank you to the Learning Center. Now, one next thing before we do get to Ambassador Shields. If you've been with us for a while, you recall that one of our goals is to grant stipends to local students to assist in their studies abroad and their experiences. So I'd like to ask Chip, our treasurer, Chip, if he will come up and provide a brief report on our successes in this goal. Chip, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks a lot. This is a report that was going to be given by Jacek Lubecki, who is our co-chair of our scholarship committee. So I'm sorry that he didn't make it in from Statesboro tonight. So I will look at the computer to remind me of what I wanted to make sure you all heard. Some of you will remember we've had some students greet us at this time at the meeting before the speaker on their return from their trips. Well, 2 years ago we stopped having students travel from Georgia Southern and from Savannah State. And it's only this term that students are going back. So I'm pleased to tell our membership that we have awarded 13 scholarships to Savannah State students and Georgia Southern students, some of whom are on the way right now. And this is all thanks to the generosity of our members and our sponsors, for that matter. They're going to be studying in 7 countries: South Korea, Japan, Portugal, France, Germany, Spain, and Colombia. I'm putting an asterisk next to Japan because they may not let them in yet, but we will get that scholarship money back for the next student if they don't, so don't worry. In addition, as we've done in the past, we are linking many of these students' experiences with classrooms at Savannah's high school, Sol Johnson High School and Jenkins High School, in cases where the curriculum matches where they're going to be on their studies. This is a wonderful thing for juniors and seniors in high school. The teachers are just love this. We did this for a couple of years before COVID. They love it. It's very enthusiastic. It gives a junior in high school a chance to think about what he or she could be 4 years down the line. And we think part of our whole mission is to make sure that our whole community is linked in more internationally than they have in the past. So we think starting at a younger age is a pretty good thing. No disrespect for this crowd. So with your continued support, we're going to continue to expand that scholarship program. You can visit our website, that's www.savannahcwa.org, for more details on how you can earmark donations to that particular activity if you want to. Jim, thanks. See me afterwards if you have any questions, okay? Thanks.
That's great. Thanks for that good news, Jim.
Yep.
And I do have one more page, which I don't see right here. But what I would like to say, we encourage our members to become corporate or individual sponsors. We have several levels of support. If you decide that that's a way that you would like to support the program, dues, yes, but if you would like to become a sponsor, or if you have friends or an organization that you believe would like to support a local volunteer organization such as the Savannah Council on World Affairs that can actually produce good news like Chip O'Brien just reported, please let us know, and we will have a couple people by the door on the way out. Susan Barton is one over there, and and Fred back there. Good, thank you. So, now to our speaker. Retired Ambassador Dan Shields is a educational editorial advisor to the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs. And he lectures, in doing so, he lectures, teaches, and conducts simulations relating to diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific region. He collaborates as he does so with the United States Army War College, the University of Michigan School for Public Policy, and a Ford School, actually, of Public Policy, and the University of Pennsylvania Carey School of Law. So he's engaged with those three and is active and stays current. Before retiring from the State Department in 2015, he was detailed as the diplomatic advisor to the Commandant of the United States Army War College, and that's a general officer, 1 or 2 star, depending on where they are in the assignment process. He also served as the U.S. Ambassador to Brunei from 2011 to 2014 and led 2 other diplomatic missions in Southeast Asia as a Chargé d'Affaires, acting ambassador to the U.S. mission in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, in Jakarta, and the U.S. Embassy in Singapore. His earlier assignments were mainly in Japan and China. His first tour in the Foreign Service was as a vice consul in the embassy in Manila from 1985 to 1987, where he reported to Washington on the people power demonstrations and the fall of the Marcos regime. Ambassador Shields was there. So to his topic, what diplomatic successes and or challenges might we expect in the Indo-Pacific region in 2022? Ambassador Shields will offer his perspective on the diplomatic instrument of power and what to expect. He'll focus on the diplomacy of the South China Sea, an issue he's worked on throughout his 33 years of foreign service. He'll also discuss the Korean Peninsula nuclear diplomacy on which he worked during his time in the embassy in Beijing during the six-party talks. Finally, he'll address the relationship between the diplomatic instrument and other instruments of power, including the military, economic, and informational instruments of power. So, following this presentation, Ambassador Shields will take questions, and so at this point, it is my pleasure and an honor to welcome to the podium Ambassador Dan Shields. Dan.
Okay, well, I appreciate the help. Thanks for the warm introduction, Jim, and we'll get my PowerPoint teed up here. But first, I just want to say I'm really excited to see such a big and lively group here tonight. I really, it just inspires me to think that there's this much interest in the kinds of topics that we'll be discussing tonight. So I'm certainly inspired by your presence here tonight. Okay, well, thanks for getting the PowerPoint teed up here. So the State Department mandates that even though I'm retired, that I say at the beginning that the following are the speaker's own views and not an expression of U.S. policy. Maybe you've noticed sometimes when diplomats, including American diplomats, talk, sometimes they're very careful about what they say. And the reason is they can't make mistakes, right? Their basic job is to convey U.S. policy and to convey it accurately. So now that I'm retired, I don't have to do that anymore. Okay, so the basic structure of the presentation will be, we'll take our inspiration from the late Secretary of State, also General Colin Powell. And I think he did as much as any American of his generation to help build understanding about the various instruments of power. I know some of our group here tonight have military backgrounds, and so you may be familiar with the acronym DIME. You've probably heard a lot about the DIME. So it's just a shorthand way of remembering various instruments of power: diplomacy, information, military, and economic. But it's much more accurate to talk about DIME plus, right? Because those are clearly not the only four instruments of power that the United States or any other government has. There are things like law enforcement, for example, that could be seen as an instrument of power. So there financial power can be distinguished from economics. So the DIME is just a simple way to remember, but you can always add another letter to the acronym, and it would be correct to do so. So with regard to the structure of the presentation, first we'll talk a bit about defining the terms, right? It's always good to start by defining terms, so we'll start the discussion that way, talking about diplomacy and some closely related concepts. Then we'll discuss, number two, whether American diplomacy is distinctive, whether the way that Americans do diplomacy is different from the way that, for example, the British or the Japanese or other countries do their diplomacy. Then number three, we'll talk about some diplomatic challenges in the Indo-Pacific in 2022. I specifically decided not to focus this on China. I think everybody hears a lot of discussion all about China, so I'm not going to make that my main focus. And I confess right from the beginning, I'm not a Russia expert or a Ukraine expert, although I'm certainly happy to talk about that a bit and have that discussion in the Q&A. But so what I want to focus on is Burma or Myanmar, and then the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue and the South China Sea issue. Now, I said I'm not going to focus on China, but in reality, China is in the background on all of those issues. You just can't talk about the Indo-Pacific region without talking about China. So we will cover it that way. And speaking of defining terms, what do I mean by the Indo-Pacific region? Well, some of the Navy likes to talk about from Hollywood to Bollywood, right? So it's looking at the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean and the countries that touch on those oceans. But every different speaker will have a slightly different definition of what the Indo-Pacific means. And then number four, we'll talk about the future of diplomacy, just some brief thoughts, and then we'll shift into the Q&A. Okay, so the first part of the presentation is about diplomacy and related concepts. If you pick up your Webster's dictionary and look up diplomacy, you'll see the art and practice of conducting international relations, as in negotiating alliances, treaties, and agreements. So that's definition number one. Definition number two is tact and skill in dealing with people. So tonight we'll be talking about definition number one. Definition number two, that's important. There's not enough of that kind of diplomacy in the world. We can always benefit from more tact and skill in dealing with people. But definition number one is our focus. And I think it sometimes creates confusion, these two different meanings of diplomacy. Because diplomacy is certainly not all about being nice, telling other governments what they want to hear. Sometimes you have to deliver tough messages, and sometimes you have to deliver them in tough terms. But I do think that it is a mistake for a diplomat to unintentionally offend the host government that they're talking with, right? You want to be intentional about how you're delivering your message. If you're saying something that's going to make the other government angry, you should be doing it very intentionally. So I like to distinguish between those two. Okay, with regard to terms like negotiating or negotiations, as you see, there's a reference to that in the dictionary definition. I found that kind of confusing, having spent years working in diplomacy, because I think one of the biggest gaps between diplomacy as it's actually practiced and the image that many people have about diplomacy centers on this question of negotiation. Because in real life, at least in my experience, diplomats don't spend that much of their time really negotiating, in the sense of negotiating a text or a treaty or alliances, treaties, or agreements. So we'll come back to that a little bit later in the presentation, but I think that's a common misconception about diplomacy, that diplomats are basically negotiators. They do that, but that's by no means the whole job or even the biggest part of the job. I think that perhaps this idea that diplomacy is fundamentally about negotiations, which you will see in many definitions of diplomacy, relates in some ways to multilateral diplomacy as opposed to bilateral diplomacy. Right? So multilateral diplomacy would be what's done at the United Nations, for example, with many different countries involved. When I was out in Jakarta at the US mission to ASEAN, there are the 10 Southeast Asian countries there. And then when the United States engages them, that's multilateral diplomacy, right? Many governments involved. Bilateral, just the two. The United States Embassy in Tokyo does bilateral diplomacy with Japan. So I think that negotiating a text is much more common in the world of multilateral diplomacy than bilateral diplomacy. Okay, I think we've covered these points. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, communications and diplomacy. So former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright has defined diplomacy as communications between governments. And I actually like that definition. It's very simple, but very clear. And I like the focus on communications rather than negotiations. In terms of why bilateral diplomats don't negotiate with each other, I'm not saying they don't at all, but it's a small part of the job. I think it's largely because in a mature diplomatic relationship, the basic texts, the basic agreements are already in place, right? You don't need to sit down and negotiate a text. It's already been done. And this really sunk in on me when I was the Cambodia desk officer at the State Department from 1993 to 95. And this is as Cambodia was emerging from the chaos of the Khmer Rouge era. And the United States and Cambodia still had diplomatic relations, but they had been suspended. There was nothing going on. So we had to rebuild the relationship kind of from scratch. And we actually had to negotiate very basic agreements governing our cooperation in cultural areas, economic areas, all kinds of things. And that's when I realized that's the negotiating phase, right? It's when you're establishing the bilateral relationship. Once it's mature and well established, it's largely about implementing the agreements that are already in place. And then sometimes a new issue will come to the fore, right? Like cyber issues probably weren't very prominent 10 or 20 years ago. But so that's the kind of thing that you might need a new agreement to cover. I'd like to touch a bit on persuasion and diplomacy. So my own working definition of diplomacy involves these three elements. Communications between governments, borrowing from Secretary Albright, in which each seeks to advance its national interests and or values. Again, this has to be in the context of foreign policy, right? Diplomacy serves foreign policy, and diplomats don't decide what the policy is, they implement it. And number three, by persuading the other governments to say or do something, or refrain from saying or doing something that will advance national interests and values. So the point there is the other government that you're talking to has to be able to make things happen for it to be really worthwhile doing diplomacy with them, right? If they can't deliver, if they're an ineffectual government, there's not much point in talking to them or persuading them. With regard to public diplomacy, it doesn't fit too neatly into this framework, but in public diplomacy, diplomats engage the people, the ordinary citizens, the media, institutions, universities, think tanks, and so on. So I think one way to look at that is, in many cases, it's one government indirectly trying to influence another government, right? Either by talking to the people, by talking to the media, by talking to universities and think tanks, thought leaders, if you will. Okay, let's move to part two of the presentation. Is American diplomacy distinctive? So there's this Jeffrey Wiseman article that some of us were discussing a little bit earlier, but it's called Distinctive Characteristics of American Diplomacy, and it highlights 7 key points. And they're pretty negative. Frankly, the first time I read this, I was a practicing diplomat, and I got a little bit angry when I read this, because it just seemed kind of insulting with regard to US diplomacy. But here's what Wiseman says. A general, long-held distrust and negative view of diplomacy, domestic politics' higher influence over foreign policy and diplomacy, a tendency to privilege hard power, especially military power, over soft power in foreign policy, a preference for bilateral over multilateral diplomacy, ideological underpinning, not talking to the enemy, a significantly higher proportion of politically appointed ambassadors. So in the United States, that's typically been about 30% politically appointed versus about 70% career Foreign Service officers like me or Ambassador Silverman. And then a direct low context negotiating style. So perhaps some of those things might resonate with you. And as I said, when I first read this article, I was a bit angry. But when I reflected on it, I thought, okay, if the context is how is US diplomacy a little bit different from British diplomacy or Canadian diplomacy, I can kind of see Wiseman's point. But I don't agree with the impression that it leaves that US diplomacy is ineffective or can't get things done. And I think as a kind of useful context for looking at the Wiseman article, it's good to look at Walter Russell Mead's scholarship. And he wrote about foreign policy. And remember, diplomats are implementing the policy rather than setting it. But he identified these 4 schools of US foreign policy throughout history. Number 1, the Hamiltonian school. And sorry for the oversimplification, but just to briefly touch on it for people who may not be familiar with the idea, the Hamiltonians wanting a strong government focused on finance and trade. The Jacksonian school wanting a strong military and populist economics. The Jeffersonian school wanting limited US commitments overseas. And then the Wilsonian school wanting a world order based on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So connecting those 2 things, the Wiseman article and the Mead book, what I think Wiseman was talking about when he highlighted these somewhat negative, distinctive characteristics of US diplomacy, I think he was largely thinking about Jacksonian foreign policy. So I think in that time, when the US is going through one of its periods of Jacksonian foreign policy, I think that diplomacy then does tend to be downplayed, de-emphasized. And I think that in a less Jacksonian administration, then diplomacy can rise to a more prominent role. And I think we're seeing a bit of that. I know this is a strictly nonpartisan group, so I will keep my remarks in that way. But I think we can see a bit of that shift from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, where I think President Trump had a picture of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office, right? President Biden doesn't have that. So I think it's a shift from a Jacksonian to a less Jacksonian approach. And I think the school's still out on what the Biden administration's approach will be, whether it's Hamiltonian, Jeffersonian, Wilsonian, some blend of the above. Okay, so Mead also explores what he calls the paradox of American diplomacy. So American diplomacy does generally have a pretty bad reputation, right? It's not like the US military in terms of being world-renowned. Diplomacy doesn't perhaps get as much respect in the United States as it does in some other countries. But despite that, American diplomacy has made, it would be hard to imagine the United States being as powerful as it is without having a strong tradition of diplomatic accomplishment. And I think if you look at US history, you can certainly see that. Whether it's Benjamin Franklin getting the French to intervene and support the American Revolution, or Secretary William Seward's role in keeping Europe out of the Civil War. Secretaries George Marshall and Dean Acheson pushing through the Marshall Plan, NATO, rebuilding the world order after World War II. George Kennan's contributions on containment and winning the Cold War. Dr. Kissinger, notice I don't call him Secretary Kissinger, right? Because part of the time he was Secretary of State, part of the time he was the National Security Advisor. So let's just say Dr. Kissinger. But his work in support of President Nixon in establishing diplomatic relations between the United States and the PRC, or technically creating the opening to the PRC, which later led to diplomatic relations. And then Secretary James Baker's work in support of President George H.W. Bush in ending the Cold War and building the coalition for the Gulf War. So there's a lot to be proud of when you look at the history of American diplomacy. And I keep it in the relatively distant past so we avoid the current controversies, but American diplomacy has certainly contributed quite a bit to US national security. Okay, but it's not all successes. The post-World War I American diplomacy went badly with the United States first championing, then walking away from the League of Nations. The Nixon-Kissinger era, they had this idea that they could negotiate an acceptable end to the Vietnam War, and of course that did not work out. The diplomacy in advance of the Iraq War in 2003, and I mentioned the late Secretary Powell, but unfortunately one of the things that is not the brightest moment in terms of his reputation was his representations to the world that WMD would be found in Iraq, which is not what happened. Afghanistan, right, where the State Department kind of raised its hand and said, we'll lead the civilian reconstruction effort, and found that it wasn't particularly well suited to carry out that task. And then one that I worked on, it's not on the scale of some of these others, but the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where the United States rolled out with great fanfare this idea of a trade agreement that would span the Pacific and that was very progressive. And then because of political developments, but both of our presidential candidates in leading up to 2016, later President Trump and then Secretary Clinton, both decided they didn't want to pursue the TPP. So the other parties to the negotiation went forward with what's now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it was another case like the League of Nations, not on that scale, but where the United States teed up the idea and then walked away because of domestic politics. Okay, so we see the pros, we see the cons. So does diplomacy work? And obviously sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But in terms of when it works, I think one key prerequisite is that there be another functioning government to engage, right? If there's anarchy, if there's nobody who's answering the phone at the other end or who can actually deliver anything on the other end, it's extremely hard to get anything done with diplomacy, right? And then the other question is there a mutually acceptable deal to be made? And sometimes these conditions just do not exist. And when that's the case, then diplomacy can't really solve the problem. And I mentioned I'm not a Ukraine or a Russia expert, but I think that's exactly the question right now. I was checking my phone before I came up here just to see if war had broken out yet. So if it hasn't broken out since the last time I checked my phone, the diplomacy is still kind of alive, still kind of going, but the basic question, is there a mutually acceptable deal to be made? One that would respect U.S. national interests, U.S. national values, but also those of Ukraine, Russia, Europe, etc. Even when diplomacy does not succeed in the near term, it doesn't mean that it's finished forever. As long as the states are still around, there can always be another round of diplomacy because circumstances can change, or people can just come up with a new idea, a new approach they haven't thought of before. So diplomacy never really finishes, in my opinion. Okay, in terms of when diplomacy and that whole network of embassies that carry out our diplomacy around the world as directed by Washington, when they really prove their value is when things get chaotic. What do we do when there's an attempted coup? What about large demonstrations in the streets? And in those kind of chaotic situations, that's when Washington needs the most to have its trusted people in the country where the problems are happening. And this is when Twitter and all the advanced information technology that's around doesn't really do you much good, right? Because unless you have people you can trust who are there and who can see themselves what's happening, you don't really know what's going on. Jim had mentioned that I was lucky enough to serve in Manila at the time that the Marcos regime was falling, and I was an extremely junior officer. It was my first tour. But I saw it happen that night with, there had been an election, right? President Marcos became maybe overconfident, allowed an election. His challenger, Cory Aquino, by most credible accounts, won the election, and Marcos didn't cede power. Demonstrations broke out, people power demonstrations, just a massive scale. And I got called into the ambassador's office that night as the late Stephen Bosworth, our ambassador, was kind of making the deal, talking to Marcos, talking to Aquino, calling back to Secretary Schultz and various others, Senator Paul Laxalt, who was a kind of special envoy for President Reagan at the time. And it all kind of worked in the end. And the U.S. military was able to fly a helicopter from then Clark Air Base to the Malacañang Presidential Palace, pick up Marcos and his wife Imelda, fly them to the U.S. Embassy, where I saw the helicopter land that night, and then on to Clark from there, and then on by plane to Hawaii. So that was when I really saw firsthand, okay, this is pretty valuable, because that could have been a disaster, it could have been a bloodbath, and it wasn't. And it was mainly because of the good sense of the Filipino people and the efforts that they were making. But our embassy, I think, played a supporting role, which was valuable. Okay, let's move to part 3 of the presentation. And here I'd like to shift gears and talk about some specific diplomatic challenges in the Indo-Pacific region this year. And the reason I want to do it this way is it's interesting to talk about diplomacy kind of in theory, right, in general terms. But until you relate it to specific problems that are out there in the world today, I don't think you can really see the full impact, the full potential of diplomacy. So that's why I'm taking this approach. And the problems that I've identified are all problems that I've personally worked on and that I and the others involved in the effort failed to resolve, but they continue to be live issues these days. So the 3 will drill down on our Burma or Myanmar. And let me just say now, Burma is the term usually preferred by pro-democracy elements. Myanmar is the one that's favored more by the military there, the Burmese or Myanmar military. They're actually the exact same word in the local language, just different English versions. So anyhow, I'll say Burma, but if I were in a meeting of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and I said Burma instead of Myanmar, they would get up and walk out. So if I slip, but anyhow, my sympathies are with the democracy crowd, so I'll say Burma. Then we'll talk about the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, and then we'll talk about South China Sea. And as I mentioned, China's always there in the background, even though we aren't specifically focusing on U.S.-China relations. Okay, so first, with regard to Burma, Myanmar, so what's the problem as of now? So the Tatmadaw, the military, staged a coup approximately 1 year ago. The government continues, and these are kind of separate issues, although they're a bit interconnected. The government there refuses to allow the Rohingya minority who were displaced in 2017 to return safely to the country. So those are basically the two big problems right now. And what had been at least a semblance of civilian rule has been suppressed. And Aung San Suu Kyi, who was the democratic leader, is in prison now on, I think, politically motivated corruption charges. Okay, why does the United States care? So here's another key thing in diplomacy, right? You have to link it back to U.S. interests or values or both. So I would say this issue is largely about democratic and humanitarian values. But there is a kind of an interest issue, right? Because if the United States is concerned about the possibility that China or some other country would dominate the Indo-Pacific region, then one logical response is to step up our engagement with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, okay? But ASEAN has 10 members, and one of those is Burma. And they like to do things at the level of 10, not the level of 9. And so when U.S.-Burma relations become really complicated, U.S.-ASEAN cooperation also becomes really complicated. So there's an indirect interest. So what was my experience? So I worked on the issue in 2010 in Washington. At the time that there was a kind of thaw. We always had diplomatic relations, but the pro-democracy elements like Aung San Suu Kyi, before 2010, like Aung San Suu Kyi, for example, was under house arrest. But she finished her term, and much to everyone's surprise, the military actually let her out, and she was able to compete in elections. She won, and so there was a kind of bloom of a kind of democracy in Burma, but still the military retained a very powerful role, and it was written into the constitution. Okay, what happens next? So in 2021, the ASEAN chair that year, Brunei, had basically excluded the military regime leaders in Burma from the ASEAN meetings. This year, Cambodia is the ASEAN chair. And so one of the first things that Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen did after he became the chair is made a visit to Burma and met with the regime leader. They just finished a meeting now, a Cambodia-chaired meeting of the ASEAN foreign ministers. And Cambodia's initial impulse was to invite the Burmese foreign minister, but there was a kind of revolt in the rest of ASEAN over this issue. So as a result, he was not invited. But typical ASEAN compromise, they said, you can't come to the meeting, but you can attend as an observer by Zoom. So that was what they settled on. So, okay, what's the way forward? What's the future? I think it's got to be elections, right? That's usually the way you get out of this kind of a box, but they have to be credible elections. Even the military regime has said they're willing to have elections in 2023. And frankly, I don't think anything's going to happen this year with Cambodia as the ASEAN chair. So I think 2023, when Indonesia is the chair, we may well see elections, and we should push for them to be democratic and credible elections. Okay, and there's the map. If you notice Burma, it's kind of sandwiched there between India and China, and I think that's almost the clearest example of the dilemma that Southeast Asia faces. I mean, throughout its history, actually, it's always been kind of sandwiched between India and China. They both had deep influences on Southeast Asia. They've both been deeply influenced by Southeast Asia. But Southeast Asia is a region that has been pretty successful over the years at finding a way to balance off these big powers. Right now, the problem is China is so powerful. The Chinese economy is maybe 5 times the size of the Indian economy. So the idea of balance gets pretty complicated when there's such a disparity. But I think if you look at the trends, perhaps India will be narrowing the gap in the years going forward. India has much more favorable demographics. Their economy is growing faster than China's economy. And you're seeing India step up a bit more in Southeast Asia. For example, India's decision to sell the BrahMos missiles, anti-ship missiles, to the Philippines. which will have implications for the South China Sea and Philippines' efforts to defend themselves from Chinese encroachments in the South China Sea. Okay, next topic, Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. So what's the problem? Basically, it's that North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK, continues developing nuclear and missile capabilities. Why does the United States care? What's the US interest? Okay, one thing is some of these capabilities, if fully developed, could directly threaten the United States. And then also places like Guam, right, which are US territory in the region. But the even more pressing concern is what the DPRK can do to US allies like the Republic of Korea, South Korea, the ROK, or Japan. And then there's the question of US values, right? The United States is against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So we're committed to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT. So if North Korea is successful in fully developing nuclear weapons capabilities, this is a fundamental threat to the NPT. What was my experience? So the time I really became deeply immersed in it was when I was in Beijing as political minister counselor 04 to 07 during the six-party talks. So China hosted, the United States was there, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, Russia. So that in some ways was the last really big, comprehensive, multilateral push to try to solve this issue. We worked very hard. We did not solve the problem. President Trump, in his administration, made that kind of personal diplomacy, that leader-to-leader diplomacy, talking to Kim Jong-un. And frankly, I supported that. Usually you do want to have everything teed up before the leaders meet, but nothing else was working, and I think it was worth trying. But that didn't resolve the problem either. So. Right now, where are we? The United States is ready to engage with North Korea in diplomatic discussions. The North Koreans keep testing. They keep testing their missiles. The concern is that they'll resume testing the really long-range missiles, so that would be a big concern. I don't think anything is likely to happen while the Beijing Olympics are going on, right? Because China is the critical neighbor to North Korea. If North Korea does something very provocative during the Olympics, it would take the spotlight away from the Olympics. So I don't think anything dramatic is likely to happen before the 20th. Okay, and here's our North Korea map for the visual folks, and you can see the way North Korea is situated there between China and South Korea. Okay, and the third and final topic that I wanted to highlight is the South China Sea. So what's the problem in 2022? Basically continued assertive Chinese behavior in the context of the long-standing territorial dispute. China, as I'm sure you're all familiar, has built up and militarized artificial features in the South China Sea. They're not islands. We don't use the word islands because that has specific meaning under international law. So they're not islands. But and then there was international arbitration, the 2016 Hague Tribunal finding that said China's, quote, historic claims, the so-called 9-dash line, that they don't have meaning, they don't have a basis in international law. Because China joined the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. So when you join UNCLOS, you waive historic claims that are outside the UNCLOS context. Okay, why does the United States care? Our values, right, involving international law and the freedom of the seas. And then the negative impact on the United States directly, but even more on our allies and partners if China or any other country were able to control the South China Sea. $3 trillion in annual trade passes through those waters, and energy resources go from the Middle East through the South China Sea to China and to Japan and Korea. So it's incredibly important. So what was my experience? When I was leading the U.S. mission to ASEAN in 2017, we spent a lot of time on South China Sea issues. When I was in Brunei, the only access to the sea is the South China Sea, right? If you look at the map, that's the only way. And the same is true, by the way, for Vietnam, right? That's their only access to the sea. So they're very interested in that. But other places too. My whole career somehow ended up revolving around the South China Sea. So Singapore, China, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines. All right, what happens next? So one important point is that the United States continue its freedom of navigation operations, FONOPS. Because what that says is, when China says, well, we build up these artificial features and we militarize them, if the US Navy just sails right by and acts like they aren't there, in some ways China does not achieve its objective, right, which is changing the behavior of other players. And the United States has capabilities in this regard that a lot of other navies do not. So that's important. On the diplomatic lane, ASEAN and China have been talking for a long time about concluding a code of conduct in the South China Sea. This has been going on for about 20 years since a weaker declaration on conduct in the South China Sea was concluded. There's going to be a push. China, for years, kind of dragged their feet on the code of conduct, but now, in recent years, they've been advocating for it. But I don't know what the content of the negotiations are between ASEAN and China. That's not public information. But judging from press reports, China's trying to insert some disturbing language in there, basically excluding other players from military involvement in the South China Sea or economic development like oil resources and so on in the South China Sea. So a lot of the Southeast Asians are wary in this context. So I don't think anything's going to happen on the code of conduct this year. Again, maybe next year when Indonesia's the chair, there might be more developments. Okay, and so here's a Southeast Asia map, and right in the middle there is the South China Sea, and you can see it ringed by the claimants. Okay, and as we get ready to close, I just thought I'd spice it up with some photos. So that was me calling on the Secretary General of ASEAN in 2017. He was from Vietnam at that time. Right now there's a Bruneian in the position. And ASEAN, it is an international organization, and the Secretary General, they always have very capable, talented people there, but it's an international organization that's really driven by the states. The Secretariat is not that powerful. It doesn't have that much money. It doesn't have that much power. It's really the states, and particularly the chair for a year, who drives ASEAN. This is when Secretary Clinton came out. I wasn't giving a speech that she was listening to. I was introducing her in this picture. But that's when we had opened a new building at our embassy in Brunei, and Secretary Clinton came out to officially open the building. This is Secretary Clinton is in the foreground there, and sitting next to her in the middle is Prince Mohammed, who at the time was the foreign minister of Brunei. This was an interesting program that they were launching. It was called the Brunei U.S. English Language Enrichment Program for ASEAN. And so this was in a time when, this one's from 2012, this is at a time when the oil price was high, kind of like today. And so Brunei's pockets were pretty full, and the Bruneians were willing to fund this $25 million project over 5 years. So students from around ASEAN would come to Brunei first, study English, Brunei speak excellent English, and then they would go to Hawaii to the East-West Center and study further there. So it was a wonderful program. And then this is me greeting the Sultan of Brunei. And I know that Savannah is a big center for aerospace and aviation. The Sultan, His Majesty, is a passionate aviator. When he met President Obama in Washington in 2013, he flew in on his own airliner. I think it was a Boeing. He also has some Airbus that he flies. He flies Black Hawks as well, fixed wing helicopters. So he loves to fly. And here is Secretary Mattis coming out to Clark in the Philippines. So it's no longer a U.S. base. It's just kind of an air facility. It's used for shipping and so on. And but that's where they held the meetings of the defense ministers. One of the really important sources of ASEAN's power is its convening power. They host all of these summits, and they culminate in the leaders' meetings. So wrapping up the final part of my presentation, excluding the Q&A, but talking about the future of diplomacy, rebuilding the legacy of Kennan, right? So I think, I hope that some of the examples that I've highlighted shows the importance of diplomacy and of having embassies. I think the essence of the State Department institutional culture is this ability of connecting people who have expertise about the host country, but then also expertise about Washington and who are trusted by Washington. I think that's where state can make a contribution. I think that's where George Kennan made his contributions on containment. But we have to rebuild those capabilities. I think state has let those capabilities slide. Like many other parts of the US government, state was really strained by the efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq. And there was an effort to just bring everybody we could to those places. The problem is there was some sacrifice of language training, area studies, like deepening that kind of capability for our officers. So I think state has to work on that in the years ahead. Okay, and then finally, in terms of future diplomacy, other challenges, the Biden administration is putting its stamp on American diplomacy. It recently released a very interesting Indo-Pacific strategy. I think the big challenge there will be fleshing out the economic part, right? The U.S. Remains deeply engaged militarily in the Indo-Pacific, but once we decided not to do Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, we haven't yet put forward a viable alternative to be a centerpiece for our economic engagement. So there is a much anticipated framework that's supposedly coming out soon, so we'll have to look at that and see where it goes. There is potential, right, because this whole supply chain issue, given the port, I'm sure people here are well aware of these supply chain issues, supply chain disruptions. So there is a chance as we try to build more reliable supply chains to shift in a way that gives an economic focus to our efforts in the Indo-Pacific. So I'm hopeful in that regard. And then some of the other issues, role of non-state actors going forward. The question of security risk, I think state tends to swing between extremes in dealing with security risk. I think we have to be a bit more rational in taking calculated risk on security. This whole question of, okay, with the pandemic and technology and so on, it's challenged traditional assumptions that sensitive diplomacy has to be done in person. Where will that go? Will leaders, I mean, leaders already have the possibility of picking up the phone, right? They've had that for a long time, but will they be able to have like virtual meetings where they feel like they're in each other's presence? And what happens then to diplomacy? I still think that we're going to have diplomats with us for a long time, because as long as you have nation states trying to influence each other, I think they'll want their trusted representatives in place. But diplomacy, it is interesting, that connection between diplomacy and communications technology. And as communications technology evolves, diplomacy will have to evolve in parallel. Okay, so for Savannah, I've touched on some of these points, but given the great turnout tonight, I realize that this, at least people in this room are clearly internationally minded and diplomacy minded. And I think that there are a lot of opportunities here in Savannah with the port, aerospace industry, educational sector, the historic district that naturally connects Savannah to the world. And I would ask you to use your understanding of diplomacy and international relations to help kind of broaden that circle. I mean, I was really fascinated to hear about the programs that the World Affairs Council is doing for young people. That's exactly the kind of thing that we need moving forward, so I applaud you on that. So you have a direct stake in U.S. diplomacy, and I hope that you use that to help the U.S. government become more effective in conducting its relations with the nations of the world. So that concludes my remarks, and let's move on to any questions or comments you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Shields, and we are going to do that. We're going to jump right into Q&A, but we only have one microphone. So if you would, if you have a question, please stand up or at least project well enough so that Tim in the back can record it. We will have this within a couple days on our YouTube channel for those who are not able to make it tonight or want to watch again. So let's just start with our questions. Are there questions to start with? Yes.
You touched on just briefly the United Nations, and I was just, given the law of the sea and other kinds of norms, what's the role of the Security Council, for one, and the United Nations in dealing with belligerent actors in the South China area and also what's going on in Ukraine.
Thank you. So just to repeat the question in case anyone couldn't hear, was about the role of the United Nations going forward and particularly problems in South China Sea and Ukraine. So with regard to the United Nations, the fundamental challenge, right, is this structural issue that's built in, right, with the permanent members and their veto power. So as a result, it's very difficult to use the Security Council effectively to check security challenges that come from a place like Russia. With the 5 Security Council members, and in this case we're really talking about issues relating to China and Russia, I think it's particularly challenging to fashion an effective UN response. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be tried, that it doesn't have to be done, because, and you've seen the press reports about the current UN diplomacy, but in my view, that's largely about shining a spotlight on Russian behavior. I don't think the UN will be able to take action directly to stop, given the veto power factor. But it is the obvious global forum, the only real global forum that we have to debate these issues and bring it out into the open about what Russia is doing in a place like Ukraine. Please go ahead.
Well, you talked about the veto power, but what about the General Assembly? Do they have any way of pressuring the Security Council, the smaller segment of the United Nations? Because it just seems like you've got a couple of bad actors up there that are not playing fair.
So short answer is not very effectively. The General Assembly can certainly debate and discuss these issues, but on issues that are of fundamental concern to the permanent members of the Security Council, they can use their veto power to stop action that they would see as against their interests. So it does put a limit on what the UN can do, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be addressing it very effectively very thoroughly in the UN context. The UN, I think, remains a highly relevant organization. Going to the other issue you mentioned about the South China Sea, really much of what's going on in the South China Sea is in this context of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. And there was that 2016 decision coming out of the Hague, the arbitral tribunal in the Hague, that made it clear that China's historical claims didn't have validity. And at some level, if you take a realist view of foreign policy, you tend to say, oh, well, what's the difference? How's that going to have an impact on China? But talking to people in the region, it does make a difference. And when the United States speaks up, the State Department recently issued a report on legal issues involving the South China Sea. People in the region are very happy to see that, because even an actor like China cares about international opinion. I mean, I think that's a lot of what's going on with the Beijing Olympics, right? Is trying, maybe not so successfully, but trying to cultivate this image of international respect for China. And so when a UN tribunal calls out China, or when the US State Department calls out China, and not just name calling, carefully researched legal analysis, that really has an impact, so it matters. So I think the UN has a role, but it's most limited when it comes to dealing with security challenges that actually come from permanent members of the Security Council.
You said it was important in times of stress to have the U.S. diplomats on the ground to feedback. So in the Ukraine, I saw this picture of the embassy. It looked enormous. How many people were in that embassy a month ago? And now they said we're taking people out. So how many do you think are left to be on the ground and be that eyes and ears that you said were important in times of stress?
Right. So the challenge in these issues is it is very important to have a presence, when things are chaotic, when things are unpredictable in a particular country, having that embassy and its ability to function and report is tremendously valuable, and to talk to the host government. But it has to be balanced against a calculation of security, right? You can't leave your embassy just operating as if it's business as usual in a situation where an invasion may be imminent. You do need to be sensitive to that factor as well. So I think those are the kind of calculations that the U.S. government is making now in terms of its embassies in Ukraine and other places that might be involved in whatever is brewing. But it's a difficult trade-off. And I think the ambassador in the country, of course, we don't have an ambassador in Ukraine right now, by the way, which I think is a shame. I think one thing that any president can do, and right now it's President Biden, is to fill the positions that we have with ambassadors. And right now we don't have someone in Ukraine. I understand we have a very good Chargé, the acting ambassador, who's doing a great job. But we should fill those jobs. But I think the ambassador, the chief of mission, and Washington have to be very careful in making their assessments about what is the value we can get by having that presence on the ground in the right spot versus what is the element of security risk, and are we putting our people, our unarmed people, in a situation of danger. In the end, too, the other thing about an embassy is you really depend a lot on the host government to provide that secure environment in which diplomats can do their job. If that goes away, you have to look at it very carefully from a security perspective in terms of leaving those diplomats in place.
I wonder if you could comment on the China-Taiwan question, having spent basically a lifetime working on that issue. How do you see that unfolding in the months and years ahead, please?
Okay, thank you. So the question is about China, Taiwan, and where we see that going. I think this is an issue that is going to be with us in a tense state for a very long time. In many ways, this whole Taiwan question has been bubbling since, at least since the end of World War II, the Treaty of San Francisco in 1952 that officially ended the war in the Pacific. But the whole question of what Taiwan's status would be was not really clearly addressed. Japan relinquished any claims it had to Taiwan, but what exactly would Taiwan's future be was never clearly settled. Obviously, for the People's Republic of China, for Beijing, they see Taiwan as an integral part of China. And in terms of the U.S. position, you have to look at the Shanghai communiques and so on to get the precise language. But essentially, the U.S. said, we know this is China's position. So in terms of where things go next on Taiwan, I think that Xi Jinping and the other leaders in China certainly have ambitions to, from their perspective, reunify Taiwan with the mainland. They see that as a kind of completion of the mission of the Chinese Communist Party. But I think others in the world want to be sure that Taiwan is able to make its own decision about its future. So I see that as an issue that will continue to percolate for a long time.
Well,
Please.
do you think China would use force?
It's the question is, do I think China would use force? I mean, it's always possible. It's not something that can be excluded. They certainly have very impressive military capabilities. They have a lot more capabilities now than they did 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But I personally don't think that PRC use of force against Taiwan is anything imminent. There's a political calculus here, right? The whole reason Beijing would want to take any kind of action against Taiwan is to, from Beijing's perspective, bring them back into the fold of China. But if they launch a destructive war, kill many people, blow up the infrastructure and so on, would they achieve what their political objective is? So I think we should be working closely to make the use of force by Beijing with regard to Taiwan as unattractive as we can. I think that's very important. But I don't think the risk is imminent.
Thank you.
What is the status of our diplomatic relations and organization in Taiwan to be able to negotiate and understand the situation there?
Thank you. So the question is, what is the status of U.S. diplomatic representation in Taiwan? So technically, we don't have any diplomatic representation in Taiwan. What there is an entity called the American Institute in Taiwan, which handles the informal, unofficial relations between the United States and Taiwan. Through American Institute in Taiwan, or AIT, I think Washington has a good idea of what's going on in Taiwan. We have good communications with Taiwan. We have cooperation with Taiwan in a number of areas. Certainly economically, the relationship with Taiwan is critically important with regard to semiconductor chips and so on. On the pandemic, we've had excellent cooperation with Taiwan. So we have very extensive cooperation with Taiwan, but since we established diplomatic relations with Beijing, it's always been on an unofficial basis.
If the U.S. had acted when China was first building these artificial military installations, do you think that had they early on acted on that, they might have been able to stop China from building these artificial installations?
Okay, so the question is, if the United States had acted when China started building artificial features in the South China Sea and militarizing them, could the United States have stopped that? I think it depends on what you mean by stopped it. I mean, certainly as a military matter, I understand they're not very difficult targets. You know, they're sitting there in the middle of the South China Sea. From a military perspective, people tell me it would be easy to do something about it. But from a sort of strategic perspective, from a political perspective, would that have been a wise move for the United States? I'm not sure. You know, the question I think is, what is it comes back to what is the U.S. interest? What are the U.S. values? I think the response at the time was the correct response, which was to avoid changing our behavior, to continue to conduct the freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, because I think that prevented the Chinese side from attaining what I believe was their political objective in the South China Sea, which is by building these artificial features to change the behavior of other states. Now, granted, with regard to some smaller states, they probably did have to change their behavior because they didn't have the capability that the United States has to continue FONOPs and so on. But there's an observer of Southeast Asia who I follow closely. We were talking about him earlier tonight, but Bilahari Kausikan is a former senior Singapore diplomat. And he said, the way he sees it, and he wrote this a few years ago, so this may not be his current thinking, but he saw the situation in the South China Sea as essentially a stalemate. He said, the United States cannot force China to tear down these artificial features and throw them back into the sea. He said, but at the same time, China cannot force the United States to stop doing its business as usual and conducting these freedom of navigation operations. So he sees it as a kind of stalemate, and I think that's a reasonable way to describe the situation. Yes, please.
Career question, that is, how's the morale these days among foreign service officers, and is being a foreign service officer still considered an attractive career option? And then reflecting on your own experience, you had to start this all over, is that where you
So I think that morale in the Foreign Service took some hits over the past few years. It's no secret. It's certainly all over the press, and yeah, it's true from the people I talk to from outside. I think that it's recovering. If you look at statistics like how many people are taking the Foreign Service exam, it's up considerably from the very uncharacteristically low levels that it was a couple years ago. But in terms of really rebuilding the State Department, getting it back to where it was or getting to where it should be, I think there's still a lot of work to do. The State Department was in pretty bad shape. I mean, just to take one example, hello, okay, this question of, test, okay, this question of all these ambassador positions that were unfilled, the Biden administration has been chipping away at that, but there's still a lot of unfilled positions. Would I do it again? Absolutely. I thought it was a fantastic career. And the thing is, you shouldn't really go into a foreign service career unless you're prepared to serve whatever administration the American people elect, right? If you're really partisan in terms of your political views, it's probably the wrong choice. If you can't work for President Obama and President Trump, then maybe it's not the job for you, you know? So, can I invite Ambassador Silver? Would you like to add anything on that?
No, I would agree with what Daniel said. I would do it over again as well. We did take a hit. It was a hit in how we were described our job. This is a very professional organization, a nonpartisan organization. We do our jobs, which is to defend, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against, as we say, all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that's what we're doing overseas. You have to have a service mentality. I defer to my people here who have been in the military. Your country owes you a great debt of gratitude. I did not serve in the military. What we do is not what you did in laying your lives on the line, but there's a very strong service mentality to this, and if you don't have that, then you shouldn't be going into it. But I will just give you one anecdote. I didn't go to a foreign country until I was in graduate school. My family never got on a plane. We didn't go on a plane during I was 21 before I went on a commercial plane in the United States, never mind overseas. And I have gotten to meet presidents and prime ministers, not just meet, but negotiate with emirs and all of this, and where else, and presidents, U.S. presidents, and where else would you get to do that?
Thanks.
Okay.
I have one question. Thinking about technology, and I'm fascinated with thinking about how technology advances the roles of how society catches up with technology. When we think about government and interaction and diplomacy, one of the questions that I had, do you think that society will be reshaped in how we think about diplomatic relations with society catching up with technology? Do you think that we'll be able to use it? There's ups and downs, but how do you think it will change the way that we interact with these countries that maybe, like China and Russia, that we've had been at odds with in the past? Maybe we want in the future, depending on how we have this cost benefit between the countries.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. Good to see you again. It's really only sunk in on me relatively recently how deeply connected diplomacy and technology are, right? If you buy this Secretary Albright definition of diplomacy as communications between governments, which I do, then advances in communications technology will inevitably transform diplomacy. And when you think about the old days when the ambassador would be sent off and then they'd send a letter from Washington, and maybe every 6 months or once a year, the ambassador would get the new instructions, and it had a very leisurely pace. That was how diplomacy was done in those days. And then with cables, right, like telegraphs, and then radio, telephones, and then, you know, all the modern things, the Zooms and the video conferences and so on, it just keeps changing. And I think the role of the diplomats changes with each advance in technology. I think, you know, as we move into this metaverse age or something, how diplomacy works could be quite different from what we're accustomed to. And I think state is certainly trying to figure that out. How do we do it? But my own view, I mean, I think this pandemic has really shaped my thinking, but people still, I think, feel this human need to be in a room with one another to have discussions. And as long as that continues, I think a diplomacy that we can recognize is likely to still be around in the future.
Okay, thank you.
First, thanks to Ambassador Shields for an excellent and interesting program presentation this evening and for your thoughtful answers to our questions. We're grateful for you helping us better understand the issues in the South China Sea, and we wish you much success in your new future work. And secondly, I would say that with the two presentations that we had last month with Ambassador Silverman and this month with Ambassador Shields, we have really been fortunate to have two speakers of their caliber and their experience to speak with us and to spend time with us. Fortunately, Ambassador Silverman, Larry, is a member and is staying around the area, and we hope to see him often. Ambassador Shields, we certainly like to see you again, and you really added a lot to our thinking here. Second, our next program is going to be a virtual one. And that's going to be this Tuesday, the 22nd. It'll be a panel discussion among three distinguished professors, and it will be moderated by Ambassador Silverman. And so, who I'm sure you remember was virtual last month, so we're lucky you're here, Larry. The discussion is entitled The Russia-Ukraine Crisis, History, Issues, and Must There Be War? Please check yesterday's email for an announcement of this program. And third, our next in-person program here will be held on March 10th, entitled India's Democracy and Its Rise in the World. So until the 22nd, next Tuesday, 5 days from now, thank you again to Ambassador Dan Shields for an excellent and enlightening presentation on the issues of the South China Sea, to our members, to our sponsors, and with that, I wish you all a good luck. See you on the 22nd.